Welcome to the Communist Labor Party podcast. Here, we feature presentations and educational pieces we feel are important in the fight against capitalism. In this episode, we return to Sophia Burns of RATPAC and Max Morgan of the CLP in the second half of the question and answer portion of their presentation on the strategy of dual power. This audio is taken from a presentation at a regional Red Skull educational summit the CLP hosted in April of 2016.
At the risk of getting too esoteric and technical, something that about the Mondragon question that Daniel raised earlier, there are economic forces are always at work. It's like we can refer to them in the same way we refer to scientific laws. And one of the things that we bring to the table as Marxists is that we can do an objective study. We can bring an objective materialist dialectical understanding to how a system functions, figure out where the incentives and pressures are inside that system to deviate from a revolutionary praxis. Like in Mondragon, it's subject simply to market and economic pressures, where in order to maximize profits, they need to revert to a capitalist mode of production. And we can see that is the case. Like we can analyze the elements inside Mondragon and project that forward a few iterations and say, here's the pressure the organization will be under, here's how it will likely change. And we can take that historical materialist perspective and look at the institutions that we are fostering, joining, or creating, and think about, well, what are the elements that are going into this process? What are the elements of the structure and the mission and the world at large in which this organization is going to exist, and how will those interactions develop over time to sort of tease out where the problem spots are and make the necessary changes to prevent these things from happening. Like in the case of Mondragon, creating a parallel political workers organization that has some power over the business entity in order to create just to lean something up, to create a more stable house of cards by leaning more things on one side, so to speak. So that's something that came to mind when we did a little Mondragon round robin, that we have the analytical tools. That's actually what we are bringing to the table that is different from any liberal institution like Mondragon. Mondragon lacks a political arm at all. They have no political philosophy or analytical arm. What we bring to the table is that analytical work. That's what makes us that is what Marxists bring to the table in any situation that makes us stand out. That is our distinguishing feature, is that analytical toolkit, and I think we can put it to work.
Right, since like an overlap of a union and a co-op is, I think, a lot more resistant to co-optation than either a union or a co-op would be by themselves. Since, like, when we talk about dual power institutions, we're talking about a whole bunch of individual institutions. Like Max said, the mid-range goal here is hundreds and hundreds of these all over everywhere. But, we can think about it in terms of this dialectical relationship between localized autonomy and larger scale networking and mutual support and coordination. And I think it's a question of avoiding both like these small atomized organizations that, are swimming through a sea of capitalism, of capitalist market forces, and the fact that the ruling class is the ruling class because it does have more power than we do, while also avoiding a situation where there's the centralized top-down control of these community institutions, and they would end up either being extremely vulnerable to co-optation at the top and the center, or would end up in what I would argue is a variant of that situation, which is the position that a whole lot of Marxist orgs put themselves into, where it's like, oh yeah, we have this independent community-based mass organization here and this one here, but they're all actually totally subordinated to the particular directives of a particular political party. And we want to avoid that as well, since, this isn't about like building the power of the Communist Labor Party so that the Communist Labor Party can be the party with power. It's about building the party of the working class, or sorry, not building, but building the power of the working class. And the only, reason why building the Communist Labor Party should be part of that is the extent to which we can be a vehicle for people to do useful work, building dual power institutions, and thus building up the power of the working class itself. If you're here because, you fancy yourself head of the Politburo of, the new revolutionary order to come, you might want, maybe you were looking for a different meeting. But yeah, it's there's that tension between decentralization and autonomy and community participatory control on the one hand, and the need to network and coordinate with each other and have the overlaps and have the density on the other hand. And that can be a creative tension, that can be a dialectical tension pushing toward a higher level, a synthesis, something new, something better. But the specific details of what that'll look like are going to have to emerge in the process of doing this. Since one thing that has never been done before is the replacement of the capitalist system and state in the United States with, a socialist one. So if we succeed, that'll mean a whole lot of uncharted territory. And like Maddie was saying, the fact of ecological crisis is going to make it a whole lot more chaotic, a whole lot more unpredictable. And, there's going to be a whole lot of other massively destructive factors and forces coming to bear on it as well, since it's all well and good to, build working class power and replace the power of the capitalist class. But even if that were to miraculously suddenly happen tomorrow, we would still have massive destructive fallout from climate change that is already starting to happen and will happen no matter what. So yeah, that's why I think an important point of the dual power strategy is that necessary emphasis on localism, on mutual support, on creating networked but still logistically smaller and community controlled ways to produce and distribute the basic material necessities of living. Since climate change, like the ecological crisis, is happening no matter what. But I think the big question is what type of approach is going to give us the best chance of cushioning ourselves as best we can. And personally, I think that, dual power very conveniently provides a way to do that, as well as providing a way to pursue a more traditional socialist goal.
Are we allowing dual comments from comrades since we're not Okay. So Maddie had an additional question. Do you given that we're looking at about a 50-year time span roughly before shit really hits the fan, do you think there's a point where we're going to have to ditch the idea of setting up state power to offset climate change and focus mostly on prep for the collapse? There's going to be a lot of steps to seizing state power and fighting these things effectively that we may not have time for. Um, is there a point where the more Marxist-Leninist project of establishing a socialist society, a state needs to be tweaked or maybe even abandoned in light of the collapse?
I would say no. The scale of the sort of food distribution, population relocation, geological engineering, and industrial restructuring programs that would be necessary to preserve civilization and preserve human life through an ecological collapse will necessitate an organizational body that, whether you want to call it a state or not, will be a state. And this is more of a value judgment than a practical statement, but I do not believe there is a point at which I would give up on attempting to preserve human civilization and the species. That's sort of like the point, I feel like. But in terms of the schedule, the sort of the scheduling of the revolution, 50 to 60 years is the time in which we have to seize state power to start making those changes before the damage that is done is truly astronomical and we run a realistic risk of losing the electrical grid, in which case we are fucked. I personally will not give up on trying to see us through the lean times that are coming until as long as I can draw breath. I'm sure that there may actually be a point at which it is more practical to cut and run for the hills, but you're going to be cutting and running to the hills with 3 or 4 million other people into an area with a carrying capacity for 3,000. So it's not at no. I don't think there is a point where that will be a real practical strategy for personal survival, because you're going to be in direct competition with millions of other people who are equally determined to survive. In an environment that will lack the resources to support all of you, no matter how strong your will to survive is. Survival for the large mass of people relies on an industrial basis, because that's how we got our population so big to begin with, was overcoming the natural limitations of a hunting-gathering subsistence strategy in terms of the carrying capacity of the land. We have artificially inflated the carrying capacity of the earth through industrial technology. And if we lose access to that industrial technology, if the electrical grid fails, if we are unable to maintain industrial farming regimens and food distribution, there won't be food for everyone. And yeah, the death toll will be enormous. And at no point am I willing to stop fighting to prevent that.
What I would say to that is, well, when we say state power, what do we mean? I would argue that in the CLP, we don't mean, getting our members elected to office within a liberal electoral system. We don't even necessarily just mean, having a government that administers within a territory and is, we are a Marxist-Leninist workers' people state, like you were referring to, Maddie. I think what we really ought to mean by state power is the logistical, organizational ability to coordinate the distribution of goods and any sort of services on a large scale, and of course the capacity to do so in a way that prevents someone else from displacing you. That's a functional definition of state that I would get at, and of course, we can go into like different types of state structures have have this class character or that class character, or, go about that basic definition that is the ability to coordinate large-scale social activity in a nearly monopolistic way. But at the root, when we say seize state power, we mean get to a situation where organizations and institutions controlled by the working class, by working, disabled, and currently oppressed communities, can make those logistical decisions at a society-wide level, which, currently we can't. Currently, it's the capitalist class that does that. Currently, the government that administers and coordinates all that is controlled by the capitalist class. But I don't see the task of ecological preparation and, building resiliency, shifting towards, you know, sustainable ways of having an electrical grid, having a type of industrial civilization. Since, when we say industrial, like what comes to people's head is, oh, there's a factory with an assembly line. But what we really mean is the large scale, planned and coordinated um, production or creation of goods and services. Since, it's like a large high school is an example of a service being provided in an industrial manner because it is organized and it is coordinated to provide something on a large scale. If something were not industrial, like the, non-industrial model of education would be each one of those thousands of students is, homeschooled with a self-developed curriculum. Um, so I do think that, obviously the way we go about industrial production has to be substantially changed, or else it will just keep exacerbating ecological crisis on the one hand, while not allowing us to make the logistical and organizational decisions that will allow us to at least minimize the impact of the damage on the other. I would say that the task of building state power, or getting state power, is the task of getting the ability to make, the decisions that will decrease the acceleration of ecological crisis and increase the ability to weather it best we can. And I don't I don't see those goals as being in conflict. I see, you know, one of our goals in, the revolutionary capture of state power is to be able to make those ecological decisions. But the ability to make those decisions inherently implies having that broadly defined state power. And the other thing that I would, would say right quick to that, one thing that we do reject is the notion that, oh no, we can't do anything until after the revolution, until we have state power. So what we need to do is build the party and build our organization so that we can be the political party that will make all these decisions in the future and make all these changes in the future after seizing state power. Our strategy is dual power, which means making the logistical decisions that we can, building what we can right now as much as we are logistically able to, the types of institutions that we want to see. And, part of that is that we want to see the types of institutions that can avoid exacerbating ecological calamity and cushion us.
We're actually overtime. No, I'm not cutting off the stack. I'm just saying if anyone wants to get on the stack, please get on the stack. and then we should wrap up commentary, and I have some parting remarks, and then we should eat, and then clean this building and get the fuck out of here. So the stack I've got right now is Steve, Daniel, Maddie. Anybody else? Okay.
Cool, thanks. So just I wanted to jump real quick on like the discussion of like ecosystem collapse and like how that should affect sort of our long-term thinking about our strategy. I spent a lot of time thinking about, is there a point at which our strategy needs to change in response to this? As a professional ecosystem climate change scientist, like it's a really depressing picture, and I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And I think like I can understand the feeling that maybe at some point like society itself will fragment too much for us to be able to meaningfully establish state power. I think is where a lot of people are concerned. Like, how can you take state power in a state that doesn't exist anymore? And I think actually the dual power strategy is our best chance at doing that. We're going to be building an alternative state, and like worst case scenario as far as like climate and ecosystem collapse is concerned, we're going up and we'll meet state power as it's coming down. Like we will have state power at the point that our infrastructure and organizations are more cohesive and more effective than the crumbling ones of capitalism. And then, you know, like whatever level of organization that is, that's the point where we have state power. And it might not be so much us seizing it as like just looking around at the smoldering wreckage and going, oh, it's just us, I guess, which will work for me. And the thing is, you know, the fevered imaginings of like right-wing survivalists aside, in the face of the sort of disaster that we're facing, individualistic survival is not a viable strategy. It's not just unethical, it's not going to work. You can't go hide on a mountain of bullets and expect to like survive. You won't. You know, we are social creatures. We need to keep our social machinery and our civilization alive if we wish to survive ourselves as individuals. You know, we cannot and we must not abandon one another. The continuing struggle for socialism is the only response to the climate emergency. That's it. That's all I got.
And just very quickly, there's a term from autonomous Marxism, interstitial revolution, which basically says that working class revolution isn't necessarily, you know, a singular one moment act, that, you know, it's a question of building working class power in this part of society or that part of society. And as you build it, you know, in each part, you push it as far as you can. And, you know, in terms of what we do, that would be developing as much dual power as you can, but that it makes more sense to think of revolution as something that you carry out bit by bit as quickly as you're able to, instead of, you know, a single unitary, yesterday it was capitalist, today there's a civil war, tomorrow we will have a socialist state, and then we'll start doing things. Like we want to avoid that model.
Just to reemphasize what Steve said, for my own area of expertise, anthropology, yeah, I mean, there's this a global ecological. I prefer not to think of it as a collapse. I mean, because there'll still be an ecology, it just won't be one that works for humanity. Yeah. I mean, that's a very limited band of what like humans can actually utilize to sustain ourselves in any way. And there won't be anywhere to run. There's no hole you can dig. There's no mountain you can climb that will be sufficient. And I mean, I think what a lot of people have an idea of is like, grab some seeds and run out into the woods and build a cabin sort of thing. And the skills required to do that basically don't exist anymore. Hunter-gatherer societies had enormously sophisticated cultures that were, I don't want to say complex, but just as deep as ours. And the skills required to live off the land have been replaced by the skills needed to live in an industrial civilization, which basically is the entire world now, with some very small pockets which are arguable. So the only way forward is to, and not just like plan around a collapse, but to prevent it from happening. and like what everyone else has said, it can't be like we will slowly build an accumulation of power until like a dam bursts, the revolution happens, and then we start fixing things. Because that won't work either. Because the not just the ecological collapse, but the collapse of individual autonomy and functioning economic institutions is happening right now. And if we wait until capitalism is so enfeebled that we can, give it a hard blow and it'll fall over, there won't be anything. There basically won't be anything left to put back together, because no matter how popular the revolution is, there still has to be the capitalist infrastructure in place to build something from. And the more institutions we can build that are resilient to that and push back against those the depredations of capitalism, the easier it will be to build back up.
So we've got a couple comments and questions now. Sam online asks, now that we're kind of talking about dual power and the lead up to this inevitable environmental collapse anyway, how will a Marxist-Leninist state deal with the displacement and genocide due to colonialism? How would land distribution work under this model? I know it's not 100% related to dual power, but it's kind of segueing into that. And then Maddie also wanted to comment. There are also indigenous folks who still know how to and develop ways to live off the land. Those places and people still exist.
As far as the question of the trying to do some sort of corrective action against the impact of imperialism, that is a very, very large, very nuanced topic that would probably require its own 1 or 2 hour workshop to even begin to unpack. But historically, Marxist-Leninist states have been fairly willing to give national autonomy to cultural or ethnic groups that desire it, in a much more authentic way than the United States has for indigenous populations in North America. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like. That would have to be a very large democratic decision that would involve considerations that haven't even occurred to us yet. So that's something we're going to have to unpack with real rigor and consideration in the years to come, because it is an open question in terms of practicality. The only thing I think that we have really nailed down is that something needs to change. And we would definitely need a lot of input from those indigenous communities and oppressed peoples to put themselves out there to advocate for their own needs and their own end goals, lest we fall to white saviorism, running in saying we will give you these things that we think you want, which would really be the opposite of helpful. As far as indigenous communities existing around the world living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle right now, they do exist. Those skills do exist in the world, but they don't exist in the overwhelming majority of the population of humans in the world. And they take many decades to learn, and the carrying capacity of the earth, even without ecological collapse, the carrying capacity of the green earth pre-industrial damage 2,000 years ago, the carrying capacity was not sufficient for the 7+ billion people to subsist in a hunter-gatherer under hunter-gatherer dynamic. The resources, we must have agriculture to support the population that exists. It's not a question of skill or will. It is simply a practical question of tonnage of food available per day. And there isn't a magic bullet answer to that problem at this time, unless somebody invents a replicator and a fusion reactor sometime in the next 5 years. But that's sort of off the table from a practical standpoint. I've got some closing remarks. Do you want to go first, or do you have any? because I'm going to be all like dramatic and like mic droppy.
So yeah, closing remarks. I think that the the single takeaway that I want y'all to come away from here is that when we say that dual power is the strategy of the Communist Labor Party, that what we mean is that we aim to be hopefully a useful auxiliary, but ultimately still an auxiliary organization working within the communities where our members exist to try to build the kind of stuff that we want to see the entire society look like, to build that now and to build that, in such a way that it's outside our control as an organization. So yeah, I will pass this off to you after reiterating again, the Communist Labor Party has no inherent right to exist or to be taken seriously. We only have any business existing, let alone growing and organizing, and let alone having anyone, want to work with us, to the extent that we do useful, helpful work within our communities, creating these institutions of dual power. If we're not doing that, then we should just disband. I think we're doing that, and I think we're going to keep doing that.
So there's a Mao quote that I'm pretty fond of about a revolutionary swimming through the masses as a fish swims through a river, or something to that effect. And what we have right now is a dearth of class consciousness and a gap not a gap, a lack of revolutionary circumstances and proletarian class consciousness and proletarian identity and development as a grouping. There is no river in which to swim at this time. Our mission as a party, as an organization, is to dig out the trench in which that river will flow. Is sort of what we're doing right now. That's where we're at right now in North America, is we've got to dig the river so that we can swim through the masses as salmon on the river, or something like that. The point is that the circumstances don't exist yet, and instead of talking about all the great things we'll do when the circumstances happen on their own, or talking about how terrible it is that the circumstances don't exist and those proles don't know what's good for them, which is things that we have heard from other leftist organizers, we have an obligation. There are organizations doing similar work all across North America, and hopefully someday we will all have gained enough ground to start seeing real, visible, tangible, invigorating results. But for the time being, we can already see little bits. We can already see chips and cracks coming off this pillar that we are chipping away at as vigorously as we can. So I'm excited. Things are looking up. And I wanted to thank everyone for taking time out of their weekend to be here and listen to us babble at you and babble at us. I feel like we got a lot of good work done and a lot of good talking. So thank you all for your time and your presence and your thoughts. And I look forward to seeing all or more of you next year.
And that was Sophia Burns of RATPAC and Max Morgan of the CLP concluding their presentation on the strategy of dual power, the process of establishing and networking institutions run directly by workers to take away reliance on capitalism. If you enjoy this content, please like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast for more revolutionary presentations, commentary, and workshops. This has been the CLP Podcast. Thank you for listening.